Welcome to the Wilmington and Northern Branch of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad. I'm Dave Husband and I'd like to share my method of hand laying switches with you. This is my current way, it's not the only way. I was taught to hand lay switches by Paul Jensen of the Schuylkill Valley Model Railroad Club back in 1976. And I have used many methods over the years to build literally hundreds of switches on different layouts. All the different methods work. I will be hand laying a code 70 number 5 switch in place. It'll have an insulated frog and non-hinged points. I don't use assembly jigs or fixtures to build my switches, and I don't solder the rail to the ties, although I have done that in the past. I use microengineering micro spikes, but microengineering small spikes would work just as well. Because I use the micro spikes, you will see me using some small picks to make a pilot hole for the spikes. I find that I bend fewer spikes when I use those picks to make the pilot holes. During the video, I will try and skip most of the spiking and hand filing and jump over that. While I find spiking therapeutic and kind of a zen thing, it is tedious to watch. So if I skip around something, that's why. You may notice that. I will also skip some of the duplicate work in the interest of time. So let's begin hand laying a switch. We'll start with the stock rails. I've already laid down the ties, ballasted it. I put it over a paper template, so I have marked on the ties where the guardrails and the point of the frog is and where the diverging route goes from the paper template. I've put a little mark where the head block is, where we're going to have a notch. And then on the stock rail, I mark where the guardrail is going to be so that I can clean that off and for soldering the guardrail to the rail. Once I have all of that marked, I'll use a small needle file and put a notch in the base of the rail. That gives me a nice clean notch that I can grind up to help the point fit properly. I'll do that to both stock rails. Now the stock rails, what we're going to do is we're going to grind out the gauge side, the inside of the rail, the base of the rail, up to the web, but not into the head. We want to leave the entire head and as much of the web as we can. Just want the base in order to clear the point when it's up against the stock rail. I like to use a belt sander, 1-inch vertical belt sander, to grind away the base of the rail and do all my rail shaping. Here there's the notch that I've filed into it. And then from that notch, I will take and use the sander to remove the base of the rail in several gentle passes, checking frequently to see how much I've taken away. As you can see, I have removed just the base of the rail. The head is intact and the web is intact. That gives you the strongest rail, but keeps it where the point will fit upwards. For the rest of my rail pieces, I use a wooden block to cut off pieces of rail for each of the different segments, the frog, guardrail, and wing rails. I've got stops made out of basswood. I took the dimensions from a switch and just measured them and put them on there. It makes it real easy to get consistent length pieces. In addition to cutting them to length, for example, this is a wing rail. I have a little stop and I can put 2 little nicks in the base of the rail using the rail nipper, and that will help me bend the rail when it comes time to fabricate the wing rails. I like to use a brass wire brush and a Dremel tool and use that to clean off the weathering or paint on the sides of the rails to give me a nice bright shiny surface I can solder to. I do the ends of the rails where I'm going to put a rail joiner, and then any place I'm going to solder the rails together. So that would be the insides of the wing rails, the ends of the frog rails on both sides, and then the stock rails where the guard rail is going to go. And then of course the guard rails get each end cleaned off. So that was a stock rail. Here I'm going to clean off just the end of a guard rail. And then the frog rail, I would do both sides back about an inch, 3/4 of an inch from the end of the rail. I like to use, for the frog rail, we'll start there. I grind a long, shallow taper, making several small cuts, and then check it. You don't want to overheat the rail. Nickel silver will overheat and turn brown. You want to do it so it stays, doesn't get that brown. You want to take away, so you just get into the web of the rail. There we have the frog point, and you'll notice I've gotten just up through the web of the rail, but not all the way through. On the points, they have 2 grinds to them. On the outside of the point, we'll take the base of the rail and the head of the rail up to the web, and then after we do that, we'll hand file that little knife edge on the gauge side right at the very end over the last 3/4, half an inch. File a nice taper to a knife edge on the top. So let's grind off the sides of the long taper. Now this taper is about maybe 2 inches long, and take it very slowly, check it very frequently, make sure we haven't gotten through all the way through. As soon as we start seeing that we're going into the web, we're going to stop and take off the ball of the rail and the base of the rail, leaving as much of the web intact to keep it strong, and leaving all the base, much of the base on the inside of it as we can intact, to give us a large area to solder to when we attach the point to the throw bar. Here we've got it ground off. You can just see that we've got it right up to the web of the rail, but not very much into it. And then we've got the head of the rail, which will file off the last inch. Now the filing off the end of the rail, I use a hand file and just make some diagonal passes. This is actually a guardrail, and I'm filing the taper on the end of the guardrail. I also do this on the wing rails. Makes a nice little taper onto it. You don't want a big bend, hook on the end of the thing. That's really not that prototypical. Here's a wing rail. The notches that we put in earlier, you can see in the rail. Right there, there's a little notch. We're going to take and use that notch. We're going to bend it at the notch to give a nice bend for the wing rail. The notch gives you a nice clean bend, not a big circular, but a nice sharp one. Here's the throw bar, piece of PC board tie. I've cut a hole, or drilled a hole in the center. It's about 7 feet long, and I've removed the insulation from both sides. I like to take a piece of wire that I make a little T out of, and I fit that through the hole, throw bar hole. And then I'll use that to hold the throw bar in position while I solder up the points. We'll see that later. Now that we've got all the components built, stock rails and all the other pieces, time to start laying the switch. I've got the switch alignment all set. I've ballasted ties. I put marks from the template onto the rail in white pencil for the guard rails and where the alignment was, the point of frog. And then I've also cut out the slot that I will have my rod that actuates the switch from underneath the layout. I've cut that out there. You don't have to make it that big. I just tend to make mine big to give me a lot of clearance and give me a lot of slack. You can make it a lot smaller than that. Now, one of the things I like to do is to position on track is I'll take a piece of the tie strip from Flex Track and use that to determine where the rail should go. I put the tie strip up and use a white pencil to make marks. Now, for the purposes of this illustration, I've made the marks really bright. If you use a gray pencil or lightly use a white pencil, they're not as obvious. For the video, I had to make them really bright so you could even see what I was doing. So we'll make some spike down the stock rail in 2 or 3 places. By putting the marks on the ties where the guardrails go, that way you can avoid spiking where the guardrails are going to be, so your spikes won't be in the way of the guardrails. Where you want something straight, you can always use a straight edge, this metal rule, to hold things, spike it at both ends, and then hold it up, hold the rule up against it. You can see I'm using the picks. That is a piece of 1/4 inch dowel with a 1/16 inch piece of brass tube, and then a number 8 or 9 embroidery needle soldered into the end of the tube. I find that makes the spiking much quicker. If you'll notice, most of the time in spiking is actually spent positioning the spike in the pliers, so the fewer number of times that you have to actually spike something, the better. By using the picks, I don't have to do any rework and have to re-spike something because I bent a spike trying to drive it into a harder tie. They all go in nice and easy. So now that was the straight stock rail. We're gonna do the curved stock rail. There's the notch that I've made in for the point to fit up. And we'll put that in there, make sure that it clears the hole in the head block. Now we're going to start using spiking to gauge. So I use my NMRA gauge, the 2 little points at the bottom, to set gauge. You'll see me using the NMRA gauge a lot. I like to use it rather than like a 3-point gauge because for a switch you're going to have to use make a lot finer gauge. Now for the diverging side, that has a curve in it, so I will gently, very carefully bend the rail a little bit so that it holds that curve nice and smoothly. And I've got the marks on the rail that I copied from the template where it can go. If you're not using a template underneath, you can take like a photocopy of a switch or something, or another commercial switch if you're copying that, and you can measure how many ties out from the head blocks, and then how wide the gauge is there, and then at a couple spots, and use that to determine where the curved stock rail goes. You'll want to put enough spikes into the stock rail so that it holds it, because you're going to be measuring gauge against the stock rail, so you don't want the stock rail wiggling around while you attach all the other pieces. So let's start building the frog. We've got the stock rails in place. I'm going to first pick the frog piece, and we're going to ground the point on for the straight route, and we're going to spike that to gauge. Now I've marked where the point of the frog was on one of the ties, so I kind of know where to start, so that gives me a starting spot. Then I'm going to gauge the other end and spike it down. One thing that you'll see is that I'm constantly checking, using the gauge to check the gauge of the track and make sure everything's in alignment. You cannot measure the gauge and check it too frequently. It always helps to make sure that you haven't disturbed something, you haven't put in another piece and moved something. So there we're engaged to the straight stock rail on both sides. Now I'm going to take it, I'm going to push the frog point to the point where the tip is engaged to the diverging stock rail. So now the tip of that frog point is engaged to both the straight and the diverging stock rails. That's exactly where you want the tip of the point. Then we'll spike the diverging route frog rail into gauge. And we'll get it in there. Once we get it all spiked down, we'll slide it up to where it is engaged to the diverging stock rail, and it is right up against the tip of the other frog point. So now we have the frog, point of the frog, where both sides are engaged to the stock rails. Need a little tweaking. You want to get that right because this is a critical part, one of the most critical parts of the entire switch. Once it's set, we'll put a little paste flux. Do not use acid flux unless you want green track. Put a little paste flux on there and just use regular old electrical solder to solder the frog points together. Just a little tack solder, keep them together. Now we'll do the wing rails. We'll do the straight wing rail first. We've already kind of put a bend in there. You can hold it up to the another switch or something and make sure you've got a bend that's pretty close. We'll adjust it later. I will spike the straight wing rail to gauge to the straight stock rail. Spike that in at the free end. Then we'll come up by the points, by the bend, and we will spike that and gauge there. So now the wing rail is engaged to the straight stock rail. Got that all spiked. Now we're going to slide it back and forth, checking the gauge. We're going to use the check gauge. That's the two little nubbies at the top of the gauge, and they check the distance between the face of a guardrail and the opposing stock rail. So we're going to check that first down by the bend. We're going to slide the wing rail back and forth until at the bend the check gauge is right, and then we're going to position, once we get it positioned, then we're going to do the check gauge on the free end of the wing rail. Get that all in position. Then we'll do the curved side stock rail. Now on this number 5 switch, there's a little bit of a bend in the opposite the long end of that wing rail. So I'm going to put a little tiny bit of bend in the rail just to make it match. I'm going to put it in position and then use my gauge to check the gauge. Make sure we're all engaged on both sides. Then once we'll do the check gauge, and we will measure the check gauge. So the check gauge on this one is good on the bend end, but on the free end it's a little tight. So I'm going to take and bend the rail out a little bit, just ever so slightly, doesn't take much. Check the check gauge, it's good on that side. check gauge there. There we go, we're good over there, and we'll do the check gauge. We've got it all in line, and we will spike it down. So now we have the frog, or the two wing rails. The long ends are engaged to the stop rails, and then the wings are in check gauge to the opposing stop rail. Next, we'll do the guardrails. Now, in my era, the guardrails were really long. In a modern road, the guardrails are shorter. You don't need to have the guardrails sticking 2 inches past the end of the point of the frog. It just needs enough, a couple wheel widths there. Like I say, you can copy the lengths of all these, the dimensions, from a commercial switch or a downloadable drawing that you find on the internet of a switch. So I've set the guardrail to the check gauge on both ends and in the middle, and spiked it down. Once again, for checking the check gauge. Making sure it's all in the right position. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm putting sometimes when you solder, the guardrails can move in towards the stock rail and tighten up. So what I'm doing is I'm putting one of these pins inside the guardrail to make sure that it has sufficient clearance to the stock rail. You can also put a spike in there and then remove the spike after you get it all soldered up in position. We're going to put a little flux in there. That's why I like to use the wire brush and remove the weathering, because it's much easier to do that before you assemble it than try and get the paint out from in those little flangeways and solder. For solder, I'm going to put one blob of solder in between the guardrail and the stock rail at each end. You want just enough to bridge the gap. It doesn't have to be completely filled. You certainly don't need enough to bubble up over the top. Then we're going to fill the flangeways on the frog. I like to make it look like a cast metal frog, so I fill up the entire, all the flangeways. You want to put enough in that it fills the flangeway. It doesn't have to come up above the tops of the rails. I'll put it in there, and then I'll run the soldering iron through there to smooth it out and to even out all the flows, and then we'll do the other guardrail. Once that cools off, we'll pull out all the pins, and I take a piece of hacksaw blade, fine-tooth hacksaw blade, and I will use that to remount the flangeways where we've filled them with solder. That cuts the solder down to the correct depth. You can rock the hacksaw blade back and forth at different angles to clean out underneath the ball of the rail and to widen the flangeway. And you want to get it down deep enough where it's going to clear the flanges of the wheel. You don't want the flanges of the wheel to be there. I can clean the face a little bit. Take a stiff brush. This is what they call an acid brush, and clean a little bit of any of the solder that may have gotten on the tops of the rail, and then use the file to smooth out the flangeways, remove any excess solder. You have to go back and touch it up, do so. And then get it nice and smooth and clear. You don't want the flanges of the wheels hitting any of those solder joints. Now we'll go to the frog. I find it easy to put several additional spikes on the frog so that it doesn't move around when you file it. And when you ream it out, we use a larger flat file to do the top of the frog because it's a bigger surface area. Find that easier. We'll use the check gauge to check the depth of the flangeways to make sure that we've got enough of the material removed. And then also that the check gauge is proper, and then that the gauge is proper. Want to make sure everything is in straight. Had to move something over just a little bit, make a little tweak. Now we'll take a smooth running truck and we'll run it through there just to make sure that we're got everything working. Now it's time to do the other diverging route. Now on a switch that's a fairly tight number or that's curved, you can flex the hacksaw blade a little bit to form a little bit of a bend and get a little bit of a curve in there. We'll do the flangeways on the frog, and then we'll do the flangeways on the guardrail. Got all those done. Clean it out. Real good. Then we'll check it out. That's why you don't want to overfill the flangeways with solder because you're going to be removing it. Least amount of solder that you can put in there to hold it is better. I also vacuum things up afterwards. We're doing the points now. You've got put the point in position in the notch. The tip of the point should fit up. If you filed that little knife edge on the end, it should fit up nice and smoothly. I'll use the rail nippers. First I put the flat end against the wing rail to mark the end. Then turn them around and cut off the point flat. Use a little hand file to dress the end so it's nice and smooth. And then we'll put those in there. That's the stop rail. Excuse me, the point rail. Now we'll do the diverging point rail. It's curved, so I'm going to put a little bit of a curve, gently, you don't want to use too much force. Put a little bit of a curve into it so it matches the curvature of the rail. I check it against the curved stock rail to make sure we're in the ballpark. Then we'll put it in, measure it off. I don't like to pre-cut my points. I like to cut them to length. So if there's any kind of a little deviation in the length of the wing rail or something else, I can get them exactly the way I need them so there's no big gaps in there. So we've got all that done. They're the right length. Now we're going to install the throw bar. I use the little T-handle to put it into the slot. Now you may have to, I make mine about 7 feet long. Depending on how big your slot is underneath your head blocks, determine how easy it is to get in there. You might have to pull up a spike or two. Then I use a pair of locking forceps, surgical forceps, with the curved end up, and the weight of the handle of the forceps holds the, grabbing that copper wire holds the point, the throw bar up against the bottom of the rail where it will be nice and snug and in position. Check it. Then I put either a little slip of paper or a little slip of aluminum foil, it's just about the width of the throw bar, underneath the rail, and then pick it up and wrap it over the top of the rail. What that does is, A, it gives me a little clearance between the throw bar and the bottom of the rail so it doesn't bind or drag and will throw smoother. The other thing it does is it prevents the point from getting soldered to the stock rail. So I don't have to worry as much about the solder being wicked by capillary action in underneath the point and gluing the stock rail and the throw bar and all that together. So then we'll put in, match up the point rail to the wing rail, make sure it's a nice even position. Since you've measured the wing rails for gauge so many times, you know that the end of the wing rail is in gauge. So if we spike it, that would put the point rail in gauge. Spike it down, then move over about 4 or 5 spikes, 6 spikes, depending on the size of the switch. Like I say, this is a number 5, so it's pretty short. And spike the point down again. Now after I get all this in position and do all of this stuff, I'll come back and I'll fill in a lot more spikes around the switch. There I've lined up the diverging side with the diverging wing rail. Once again, I know the diverging wing rail is in gauge because I have checked the gauge on the wing rail so many times. Spike that all in, and as I said, I'll come back later and add a lot more spikes to the switch to make sure everything is lined up. Now I'll come back and spike the diverging point in gauge to the curved diverging stock rail. And I'll check the gauge along there. I made my curve a little bit too not aggressive enough, so I'm going to put a little bit more curve into the rail. I'll check it and didn't fit up the way I liked, so I'm going to check the gauge on it, make sure, and then I'm going to come back and just adjust it just a little bit more. So now I've got the fit that I like. It's in gauge all the way along, so it'll be in good shape when it's fitting up against the stock rail. So now it's time to solder the points to the throw bar. I use a 4x8 piece of HO scale wood. You can also use a matchstick, or sometimes like a profile tie is good, thin tie. And I put that between the stock rail and the point rail. You just put the, actually the paper, it's the stock rail, the paper, and then the 4x8, and then the point. And that spaces it. I put it out on both sides, so that way the stress of being soldered to the throw bar is evenly distributed between the 2 points. And it makes it, make sure we have enough clearance when you throw the switch. Now you can use, if you like a tighter clearance, you can always use a 2x8 or something like that. I'll then come back and use the knife blade to make a little gap between the point rails and the wing rails. Want to build that in there so that when you're ready to come back and do the electrical, you can put an insulating in there. I'll adjust the throw bar in the slot to make sure that it's even all the way around and it's not going to bind on the sides. Then we'll put a dab of our paste flux onto the throw bar and the point. And then just to use a little tiny bit of solder. All you want to do is just enough that it flows underneath the point, in between the point and the throw bar, and solders it to there. Since we've got the piece of paper in there, and we've got the wooden block in there, we don't really have to worry too much about the point being soldered to the stock rail or the throw bar being soldered to the stock rail. Let that dry and solidify, make sure everything is good. Then we will remove all the spacers and the paper strips. You can also use aluminum foil. And I'll remove the forceps and push the wire down through the bottom, out the bottom of the road bed. And now I have a switch. Ready to wire up, ready to add a mechanism to. I use the one coming up from the floor. We've got it spiked over in the straightaway position, and we'll test it. And cars roll through it. I hope that this video gave you some ideas and encouraged you to try hand laying your own switches. It's not as hard as it looks. A copy of the handout that I gave at a NMRA regional convention on my switch laying methods is available on my website, wnbranch.com, in the how-to section. Feel free to look that up and download it and use it as a reference. Thank you for watching and have a safe day.